All right. Are we up and running? Is it time? All right, it is time. We are going to get going, although we know that some people are trying to cross the slowest crosswalk in San Francisco to get over here. And also that the cafe in this building is totally mobbed. So if anybody's trying to get their lunch there, it's quite a show because it's the first week of classes here on our campus, or at least that's why we think it's crazy over there. We are delighted to have today with us George Horvath, who is an associate professor at law at UC College of Law, San Francisco, and is one of those rare breeds of MD-JDs that you find out there. In other words, he is a glutton for higher education. But it means also that he can bring some really interesting and unique perspectives to his area of work, which is which has focused for quite some time on the interactions associated with the new devices and drugs. And so he has a lot of expertise in looking at statutory, regulatory, and implementation choices about the FDA's role in regulation in this area. And the way the multiple regulatory systems function together or maybe dysfunction together to create kind of an underlying it's called an emergent regulatory system in his bio, whose effects on medical products are quite different from those of any single system. He's been awarded by multiple organizations and in his past was on the law faculty at another university. He also clerked on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and has roots at UC Berkeley, having received his JD at Berkeley Law. So I'm just really interested in this. I know that this is being recorded, so those of you who are not able to attend in person are going to be able to get to see this in recording. And I know my own students in the Masters of Translational Medicine program are going to be pointed to this recording as soon as it's up. So thank you for spending your time with us today.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having me. In a way, this is a talk about how difficult it is to figure out whether a regulatory system is achieving the policy goals that that system was designed to achieve, and if not, how difficult it is to figure out how to reform regulation to achieve those goals. And so the modern regulatory system for medical devices is going to turn 50 years old in about a year and a half. And so it's a good time to assess how well it's doing. And let me just give you a little bit of background how I got into medical device scholarship and all. So in my first career, I was a cardiologist. I practiced as an electrophysiologist for 15 years. So a lot of the work that I did involved implanting pacemakers, defibrillators, doing ablations, treating with antiarrhythmic drugs. And in that time, I probably evaluated thousands of patients for their risk of sudden cardiac death, and I implanted several hundred defibrillators. I followed those patients. I helped them through tough times and good times. And so I want to talk a little bit about cardiac defibrillators. So the first use of a defibrillator was in 1980. I'm talking an implanted defibrillator. And so these are like paramedic units in the chest, right? So if somebody has a potentially fatal ventricular fibrillation or sustained ventricular tachycardia episode, the defibrillator can terminate that. And this was really groundbreaking because before 1980, all there were drugs. And it turned out that a lot of the drugs that were used actually increased the mortality rate. And the only truly effective drug, amiodarone, was toxic to just about every other organ in the body. And so what you were left with for these patients was they could either take a toxic drug or just rely on the hope that if they did have a cardiac arrest, someone would call 911. So you get the defibrillator, and it really changes everything. The problem was those early devices were big, dumb, and brutal. And what I mean was big is obvious, right? They were big devices. They had to be implanted in the abdomen. had to have a surgeon open the chest and sew patches on the heart. They were dumb. They could only do one thing. They could watch for ventricular fibrillation, and they were brutal because all they could do if they saw ventricular fibrillation was deliver a really massive, painful shock to the heart, kind of like the paramedics would do externally. But they were lifesavers, and they were a lot more. And so in my time, in fact, in the first half of the 15 years that I spent practicing, we learned an awful lot about how helpful defibrillators were. So in 1997, we showed that implanting a defibrillator in people who had survived a cardiac arrest resulted in a significant reduction in death at 1 year. That's the top study, the AVID trial. Made it two in 2002 on the far right, showed that in people who had had a myocardial infarction, had a low ejection fraction, but had never had an arrhythmic event, just implanting defibrillators in them significantly reduced their risk of sudden death. And then the definite trial at the bottom left looked in cardiomyopathy that was not ischemic in nature and showed similar findings. And so we realized that we could save an awful lot of lives by implanting these devices. And just in that sort of 7 or 8 years from the time I got into electrophysiology to the midpoint in my career, the devices really became a lot less big, a lot less dumb, and a lot less brutal. All right, the size came down. They could be implanted into the chest, kind of like a pacemaker, put leads through the veins. They became a lot smarter. They could record a lot of data. They could pace like a pacemaker. There were some in development that could actually predict the development of congestive heart failure. And just on the horizon were devices that could resynchronize the heart, that could pace in a way that would help with the symptoms of congestive heart failure. And they were less brutal because they could use different pacing techniques to restore normal rhythm without giving a big shock. And so over the first half of my time in actual practice, what we could do for our patients really advanced. And it was all because this incredible burst of rapid innovation. And so as I'm looking at questions about how to regulate, I'm keenly aware that we need to be careful that our regulatory system not suppress innovation, and ideally that we set it up in a way that it can actually facilitate innovation. But then came 2005, the exact midpoint of my time as an electrophysiologist. And in 2005, one of the 3 major manufacturers of defibrillators in the United States, a company that was formerly known as Guidant, it's now part of Boston Scientific, had a lot of problems with their devices. They ended up with 2/3 of all of their devices on recall. I'd implanted hundreds of these, so I had hundreds of patients with recalled devices. And these weren't any old recalls. These were what were classified as Class 1 recalls, which according to FDA regulation, FDA only classifies a recall as Class 1 if there's a reasonable probability that the device will cause serious adverse health consequences or death. And so my patients overall were fortunate. None of them died. There were some people who died as a result of these problems with the Guidant defibrillators. A few did receive flurries of shocks, dozens of shocks, because of defibrillator problems, shocks they didn't need. And they all had to live in fear, right? They all didn't know what to do. Some asked me to replace their device. Some we just monitored and tried to sort of talk them down off of whatever ledge they were on. But right, it sort of emphasized the importance of regulating devices to ensure their safety. All right, so I'm keenly aware of both of these policy goals that we have for devices, right? Make sure they're safe, I'll add make sure they're effective, and make sure that innovation is still happening that can benefit our patients. And so what I want to focus on is the FDA regulation of medical devices. You can think about FDA regulation as comprising 2 different phases, right? One is what FDA can do once a device is already on the market. All right, they can try to remove devices from the market. They can seize devices in shipment. They can get an injunction to stop a manufacturer from distributing devices under certain circumstances. But that really is not the main leverage point that FDA has in terms of trying to forward the goals of safety and innovation. It's really the pre-market assessment that FDA has. And so we typically think about FDA as a gatekeeper, right? It's that agency that keeps bad drugs off the market and lets good drugs onto the market. We think about devices in the same way, but a little bit of history. Prior to 1976, and what I'm calling the modern era of device regulation, the FDA didn't have any pre-market authority over devices. Right? It had those post-market powers. It could try to remove individual lots of devices. The manufacturers did not have to do any kind of a pre-market submission to the FDA. Right? FDA had the power to gatekeep for drugs going all the way back to 1938. All right. There was interest in giving FDA pre-market power over devices going back to at least the early 1960s. There was some attempts to develop a regulatory program, but I think it was really some problems with medical devices that cropped up in the early 70s that led to legislation getting through. There were problems with batteries and implanted pacemakers that were failing or disconnected. There were problems with artificial heart valves, components of which would dislodge and embolize. But I think the biggest one was the Delcon Shield intrauterine device. Some of you remember that, others have probably heard about it. It was an IUD, and there was a unique feature to it. The string that's used to remove the device was braided nylon. And what the braids actually did was formed a wick for bacteria to travel up into the uterus. And this device ended up leading to hundreds of cases of pelvic inflammatory disease, some deaths, right, some really serious problems. And I think all of that kind of broke a logjam and let Congress pass a law that set up device regulation. And that's the Medical Device Amendments of 1976. And this is why I'm saying the regulatory system's about to turn 50, because we are now at 48 and a half years into this era. And although the regulatory system that was set up has been amended many times by Congress, the overall framework is intact. And so I've been assuming as I put this talk together that most of you are not deeply steeped in how the FDA regulates medical devices. Is that a fair statement? Yes. All right, so here's some background. All right, so the regulatory framework was really different than what was created for drugs, right? If you create a new drug, you come up with some new molecular entity, you're going to have to go through a very rigorous process, the new drug application process. You have to disclose a ton of information. You're going to have to do typically 2 clinical trials or more. But for devices, a different framework was set up. And so first of all, the regulatory framework for devices, the intensity of regulatory scrutiny that a new device is going to get before FDA says, okay, go ahead and market it, varies depending on the risk that device poses. And so what the medical device amendments required the FDA to do was to assign each new device into one of 3 risk categories. And so these are class 1, class 2, and class 3. So low, intermediate, and high risk. And so there are some examples here. The top row, because I use this slide in my law school classes, these are in my students' law school casebook. The bottom row are just some examples that FDA provides on its public website. But low risk devices, you could think things like dental floss, Band-Aids, crutches. All right, intermediate, well, let me go to high risk devices. On the far right, class 3 devices. Implanted devices, most implanted devices are high-risk devices, devices that perform really critical functions, devices for which the patient is dependent, devices that would, by their function, carry a high risk of serious health consequences or death. In the middle, class 2, which is what my focus is going to be on today, are intermediate risk devices. The examples here, a denture repair kit, a syringe. This is a vast set of devices, and from sort of seemingly trivial devices like these out to radiology machines, so X-ray machines, CAT scanners, MRIs may be class 2 devices, even some implanted devices like certain kinds of hip joints, all right? Metal on metal hip prostheses of certain designs are considered class 2 devices, all right? And again, as you go from class 1 to class 2 to class 3, the regulatory scrutiny that these devices are going to get is going to increase before the device can be marketed. All right, so class 1 devices, low risk, there's no pre-market evaluation. Manufacturer does not have to submit any information to the FDA other than registering itself and its production facility. Any regulation FDA does is going to happen in the post-market phase. All right, class 3 devices, for a new class 3 device, a new high-risk device, the manufacturer is going to have to go through a process that sort of looks like what most of you probably think pre-market assessment is. Manufacturer has to disclose all of its designs and all of the components, how the device is going to work, and most importantly, it's got to do at least one large clinical trial. All right, so that's called the PMA process. Once that device is approved through the PMA process, there's a very good chance the manufacturer is going to modify it. Now you have another new device, and it's a class 3 device, but rather than make the manufacturer go back through the whole onerous process, there are some abbreviated pathways called PMA supplements that really allow manufacturers to make these small incremental changes in their devices once they've been approved. All right, but let's look at the class 2 devices, the intermediate risk devices. And so here, most of these are going to come through what is line 2 here, the 510K pathway. And so this just refers to the section of the medical device amendment that sets out the requirements for the manufacturers and tells the FDA what it needs to do in order to clear one of these devices for the market. All right, and so what are the requirements for these intermediate risk devices to get to the market? Well, first, the manufacturer has to follow any general control that the FDA has. So if the FDA writes up a list of good manufacturing processes, which would be anything as simple as good electrical grounding in your factory, all the way through more complicated things, manufacturer has to follow those. Those apply to all devices. Special controls, so the FDA can identify a particular generic kind of device, let's say a metal-on-metal hip prosthesis, and it can establish certain requirements for those. It can set up a performance standard, like that device has to be able to support so much weight, or it has to be able to bend and flex so many 100,000 times, or it's got to be coated with specific biocompatible materials, right? The manufacturer has to comply with those. But typically the biggest hurdle is the real 510K provision. And what this says is that the manufacturer, before it markets the device, has to inform the FDA, the secretary just refers to the secretary of the FDA, the risk class that the device is in and why it says it's of that risk class. And so imagine a manufacturer already has a device, a class 2 device. It's already been cleared by the FDA. It's on the market. Now it modifies that device. And now it needs to get a new clearance for its new modified device, right? It's got to be able to convince the FDA that that newly modified device is also class 2. And how does it do that? Well, it has to convince the FDA that it meets something called the substantial equivalence standard. And so a little bit of terminology, the new device is known as the subject device. That's the device the manufacturer wants to get clearance for. The manufacturer has to identify a device already on the market. That's the predicate device. And the manufacturer has to convince the FDA that the subject device is substantially equivalent to the predicate. And so what does that mean? First, it has to have the same intended uses. Second, it either has to have the same technological features, or if it has different technological features, it has to be as safe and as effective. And notice it's not more safe and effective, it's as safe and as effective, right? So it's a non-inferiority standard here, all right? And doesn't raise new concerns about safety and effectiveness. But the bottom line is it just has to convince FDA that its new device is close enough to a device already on the market that we don't have new concerns about safety and effectiveness. So there's a, sort of a lot of wiggle room there, but the biggest hurdle is really getting this substantial equivalence determination, because once FDA says, yes, we recognize that your device is substantially equivalent to the predicate or predicates that you cite to, then the manufacturer can go to market, and then it just has to follow the general and the special controls, right? So that's the regulatory framework in a nutshell. And again, it's set up to try to forward certain policy goals, including safety and innovation. All right, but there are two important points I need to draw out of this discussion, right? So first is that new device, that subject device, once it gets cleared, it's now on the market, it can now serve as the predicate for a newer device. The manufacturer can cite that former predicate, now it's a device on the market, as the predicate for a new device. Once that device is cleared, a little bit later, the manufacturer can cite that device. And so you get this long string of devices. It's known as piggybacking. And this can happen, 6, 12, 20, 100 times, even more as the decades go on. Each time probably involving small changes in the technology, the design, the components, etc. But over time, all of those changes can add up. And they can lead to a technology that's really quite different than a very early ancestor of the device. All right, and you can see this in one family of devices that I've studied. And so it's a busy slide, but what this is a family of 85 devices. These are catheters. Their intended use is to remove blood clots from the cerebral arteries of patients in the first few hours of strokes. All right, some of these work by just having at the end of the catheter kind of a spiral or a bunch of metal loops, and the idea is that the operator puts the catheter in through the femoral artery, up into the cerebral vessels, and just snags the clot and drags it out. Others work by suction. You put it up and you actually aspirate the clot out. But what happened was, and just to walk through this, in 2003, a company called Concentric introduced the first of these devices. All right? And then after that, over time, later devices would cite to that and then would cite to the later predicates. And you can see this for one particular device. So if we look at a device that was approved in 2021 at the very top. I apologize, time goes from bottom to top here. What you can see is you can trace the evolution of this device back through 7 earlier ancestors. So each step of the way in 2003, modified later in 2003, this device modified in 2006, this one modified in 2012, right, all the way through. All right. And so you get technological evolution, which is great if you're looking at innovation. It's unclear about the safety aspects, though. And here's where the second thing I need to talk about comes in with this regulatory scheme. Turns out that FDA's authority under statute to demand clinical trial evidence of safety and effectiveness for 510K devices is extremely limited. In addition, FDA has been really reluctant to use the powers that it has. And so what you end up with is that of 510K devices, of these intermediate risk devices, only 10 to 15% of the devices that FDA clears have any clinical trial evidence of safety. And if you take out in vitro diagnostic tests, your at-home pregnancy test, your at-home COVID test, and just look at other devices like the family of catheters I just showed you, it's only 8%. All right. So what you have is a system that allows a lot of modifications and a lot of technology change over time with very, very little clinical trial assessment of whether the cumulative effect of that technology is creating dangers or not. All right. And critics refer to that particular aspect of the problem as predicate creep, which we'll come back to in a second. All right. Similar things can happen in high-risk devices. I described how a new high-risk class 3 devices has to get a PMA approval, clinical trials, vast amounts of data submitted to the FDA. But once that device is approved and the manufacturer starts modifying it, the PMA supplements that are used, most of them do not require clinical trials. All right, and so you get a similar pattern of technological drift, technological evolution over time, without a lot of clinical trial evidence to assess the effects of that on safety and effectiveness. All right, and so this kind of jumps me into the discussion about criticisms. All right, because as you can imagine, there are potential problems here. Almost from the beginning, almost from 1976 when the medical device amendments took effect, the 510K pathway in particular, medical device regulation overall, but really the 510K pathway has been the subject of fierce criticism, both by people in medicine, by legal scholars like myself, people in industry, politicians. Some of this criticism focuses on innovation. All right, some of it you can predict pretty easily, right? So it's not a surprise that a lot of people in industry say 510K regulation suppresses innovation. All right, there was a survey that was widely cited. It was done in 2010. It was a survey of medical device company executives, and the survey responses suggested that the executives said that overall, on average, US patients get medical devices 2 years later than their European counterparts, largely because of how long it takes to navigate even what's considered to be a less onerous regulatory process, the 510K process. And some even suggested that their companies were thinking about abandoning the US market. All right. There are some more nuanced criticisms of the innovation effects, trying to identify exactly why it takes so long to navigate the process, complaints about FDA personnel being risk averse, companies that have been required to produce clinical trial evidence complaining about the long time it takes to do those. All right. Other critics focus on safety, and not surprisingly, they focus on a whole different set of issues, right? So the broad general complaint or criticism is that just too many unsafe devices make it through the regulatory process. More nuanced criticisms include criticism about the rarity with which clinical trial evidence is required, all right? The worry about predicate creep, that piggybacking process of iterative innovation without clinical trial assessment of safety is leading to unsafe devices. Concerns that once an unsafe device is cleared under 510K, it can serve as a predicate until it's removed from the market by the FDA. So that technology, assume a device is cleared for the market, some piece of technology in that device is dangerous. That can propagate down generation to generation. All right, that's a concern. And other concerns are that a lot of devices in 510K world actually combine the tech features of multiple different predicate devices in ways that have never been combined before. Right? So this was a study that was actually done by folks here, Arda Graves and Redberg. And what they looked at was one particular metal-on-metal hip prosthesis. It's the Dupy ASR hip system. And what they did was they traced the evolution of this device back through 95 precursors, 95 different predicates here, right? Sort of step by step by step. One thing that they found, none of those 95 clearances were supported by clinical trial evidence of safety. All right. So in terms of criticisms about just not having enough clinical trials, right? Here's an exhibit. Concern about that whole predicate creep process, the drift of technology. Here's an exhibit. And also just the combining of multiple technologies, right? That, you have a new device that combined the cup part of an earlier device, the femoral component of the earlier device, tapers, coatings, right? A lot of technological features that had never been combined in one. And the FDA said, well, there's substantial equivalence here of each individual technological feature to some earlier device. And so you satisfy the substantial equivalence standard. All right. So criticism for allowing manufacturers to engage in a process that's known as citing multiple predicates, pointing to different devices to support the safety and effectiveness of each individual component of your device. Right. Critics have called for reforms of the system, and some of them have been quite radical. Let me just run through a few, because what I want to focus on after this is some work that I'm doing to try to figure out how many of these criticisms are valid, where the real problems are in this process, and how we might reform it. So there are critics who, not surprisingly, just want more clinical trials, more 510K devices to have to submit clinical trial evidence before the FDA approves them or clears them, right? So some people just argue that FDA itself should use the authority it has to more frequently require manufacturers to submit clinical data. Others want Congress by statute to expand FDA's authority to do that, so to let the agency order clinical trials in a broader set of situations. FDA, came up with the proposal that out of these intermediate risk devices, it felt like it could probably identify devices that were really higher risk. Let's create this 2B category and give ourselves the power to regulate them more heavily. Others want to eliminate piggybacking, right? If there's any difference in the technology between one device and the next, then you need clinical trial data. Others go so far as to say every new device that comes onto the market, no matter how minor the modification, should have clinical trial evidence of safety and effectiveness, right? And part of the problem that I see, again, just going back to the story I told initially, right? What impact would these have on innovation, right? If not done in a careful way, right? And so I think that while a lot of these concerns are coming from the right place, they may not actually get where we want to be. A lot of these are based on anecdotes. All right, a lot of people writing in this area, researching in this area, have looked at single instances, single devices that have gone radically wrong and harmed a lot of people. Some have looked at device families, but even the biggest device family that I know of, the surgical meshes, which were several hundred surgical mesh products that were used in hernia repairs and pelvic floor reconstructions. How many devices total are we talking about there? Because there have been over 160,000 510K clearances that the FDA has issued since 1976, including somewhere between 50 and 60,000 just in the last 20 years, right? And so it's important to try to put all of this into context. And so you would think that these kind of reform proposals were being grounded in sort of solid, quantitative, empirical understandings of how well the regulatory system is doing. And you would be wrong. So there is some empirical work. All right, there was some early work, Diana Zuckerman and colleagues and a legal scholar, Frank Griffin, who showed that recalls of 510K devices were common, right? This was not a surprise, but these studies had limitations. The Zuckerman study didn't have a denominator, so there were a lot of recalled 510K devices, but out of how large a population? The Griffin study focused only on certain orthopedic devices, and so it wasn't sort of that broad scale study that you would want. The most robust study was published in 2021 by Dr. Jonathan Dubin and colleagues in JAMA. And so they looked at 28,000 devices that had been cleared by the FDA in a 10-year period, 2008 through 2017. And what they found was that 10.7% of those devices had been recalled. But if you only looked at the serious recalls, class 1 recall, it was 0.8%. Now that number is difficult to interpret because one, reporting of device problems is grossly low, right? There was an early government accountability report that said that less than 1% of all device-inflicted harms were being reported. After some statutory modifications increasing reporting obligations, now the estimates are maybe 25% of device-inflicted harms get reported, but there's a lot of harm that goes unreported, which makes it hard for FDA and for companies to recognize when a device is defective, when it's causing harm. And so that 0.8%, I think, represents the absolute best case. And if we're talking about 50 or 60,000 devices, right, we've got a group of several hundred devices that may be quite dangerous, that may be inflicting harm. And the question is, how do we adjust our regulatory system to try to identify those, but not impede innovation in the rest, okay? All of these studies just looked at plain and simple regulatory failure. They weren't really able to tease out what aspects of the regulatory system were leading to those devices being unsafe and getting on the market. So was it simply the problem of not enough clinical trials? Was it the problem of predicate creep, that continuous, incremental change? Was it the bad predicate problem that once a bad piece of technology got into, was cleared, later devices could be modeled on that? Was it combining multiple forms of technology that had never been combined before and not having to show that it's clinically safe? Right? We don't have that. And so we're kind of left up in the air to understand how to best try to achieve our policy goals by modifying the regulatory system. Now, there has been some empirical work also on high-risk devices, all right? And so again, a high-risk device to initially get approved goes through a rigorous process, including clinical trials, but the subsequent modifications, most of them are approved by the FDA without a requirement for clinical evidence, all right? The one situation where FDA will require clinical evidence of safety and effectiveness is if the manufacturer is trying to expand the uses of the device into a new population or for new conditions, all right? There's almost certainly going to be a requirement for clinical trials, but the technology change is really infrequent that FDA is going to require clinical trial evidence, all right? And you can have that same process of iterative innovation, piggybacking type, predicate creep happening in these problems. And so one example that I've cited is the evolution of one defibrillator lead, right? So a defibrillator lead just connects an implanted defibrillator to the heart. It's used to send the electrical signals from the heart to the defibrillator so the device can monitor, and it's used to carry the pacing impulses and the shock needed to restore normal rhythm back down to the heart. And in the late 1990s, Medtronic developed the transvene lead, which is here. This was a fairly thick lead, big in diameter. It had 3 conducting elements. They were coaxially wound, so one wound around another, wound around another. And they had a specific kind of silicon coating. But over the next several years, Medtronic made several modifications to the device. In fact, it got 33 PMA supplemental approvals by the FDA as it made modification after modification after modification. And in the end, what you end up with is the Sprint Fidelis lead. It's about half the diameter, so it's on the right side, half the diameter of the original lead. It's got more conductors. They're no longer coaxial. They're all tightly wound around their own core. They've got a different insulation, both external and internal. And this was rapidly adopted by the medical community. And I was one of those people because I was an electrophysiologist and this is what we used. And it was, pushed as thinner leads have to be better because there's less obstruction of veins. They're easier to remove if there's a problem. It turned out that the failure rate for these was about 4 times what the old lead was. And that was only discovered after about 300,000 people had received these. Right? And so you have that same kind of risk in the high-risk device world. And so I looked at this back in 2017. I looked at all of the devices that had been PMA approved between 2002 and 2016. And I just collected data from publicly available websites, publicly available databases that FDA lets you access on their website. And what it amounted to was there were 389 new PMA-approved devices. And there were over 31,000 modifications through PMA supplements. And so I looked at whether there were any correlations between the kind of problems that the critics have identified and the occurrence of a serious Class 1 recall. And so one of the things that I found was that indeed, the more modifications a device had, the more likely it was that it would be recalled. All right. And so overall, if a device had more than 6 significant modifications, right, it was much more likely to be recalled. And if you just focused on the cardiovascular devices, which was really what was driving this difference, the amount was really amazing. But what was interesting is if you excluded cardiovascular devices, there's no difference, right? And so that the dangers of allowing an unlimited number of modifications without clinical trial evidence of safety along the way really appeared to be focused on a particular set of devices. And to me, that suggested that maybe we could reform this particular aspect of device regulation in a more targeted way and say, look, let's focus on cardiovascular devices. If we can identify what makes them more of a risk, maybe apply those same requirements to other devices, but focus on cardiovascular devices, identify a number of modifications after which a manufacturer has to submit new clinical evidence of safety and effectiveness. And so what I'm trying to do now is to translate this kind of work into the 510K world. All right, and so what I've been doing is trying to assemble or thinking about assembling a database of the 50 or 60,000 devices that have been cleared in the last 20 years to try to answer questions like, is the absence of clinical trials really a driver of unsafe devices reaching the market? And that would seem to be pretty simple. Look at devices that were cleared with clinical trials showing that they're safe and effective. Compare those to devices without clinical trials and just ask whether there's a difference in the recall rate. All right? Maybe clinical trials for this generation of a device have a protective effect moving down because each modification of that device is going to be relatively small. So maybe for a few generations, you would expect a difference. So try to look at 2 generations, 3 generations down from a device with clinical trials. Look at whether a problem device that gets into the marketed set of devices, so a device with some technology that leads to a recall, are the devices that cite that as a predicate, are they also at higher risk of failure? Do they also get recalled more often? Does combining multiple technologies into one device increase the risk of recall? And then there's a long list of other criticisms that I've tried to set up hypotheses that can be tested using a database. And so didn't kind of make sense to jump into a 60,000 device study right away. So where I am right now, I have a pilot study. It does involve the graph that I've showed you. So this one involving this family of devices. So 85 devices, catheters to try to remove blood clots from the cerebral vessels of people having an acute stroke. All right. And so I assembled these data, the data on these devices from the FDA's website. It actually took most of the summer, a couple years ago, to download all of the data from the FDA, extract the information that I needed to determine whether there were clinical trials for the device, what its predicate was, what or predicates were, how long it took the FDA to evaluate the device, sort of collect all the data that I needed, and then to analyze it. And again, this is a pilot study, so anything that I'm going to say is purely hypothesis generating. All right. But the analysis of these devices is in this small set of devices, with or without clinical trials, the risk of recall was the same. If the device combined the features of multiple predicates, the risk of recall was higher. If there was a device that had been recalled in the ancestry of a device, it was more likely that that device would be recalled. So that bad predicate getting into the marketed set of devices appeared to be occurring in these devices. But the biggest purpose of this was, one, to see if the data was there. Two, can I generate hypotheses that I can test and kind of get the kind of useful information that I think I got on the class 3 devices from the earlier studies. And so I, tested a number of different hypotheses. And it seems to me that this is something that's reasonable to pursue. And so where I am right now in this is my next step is a feasibility study. And so what I really want to see is it possible to automate the data acquisition and analysis process, right? So it's fairly trivial to write a program that downloads all the documents that the FDA has on the public website. The challenge is turning out to be extracting information from PDFs, right? So the information, particularly about the predicates. So this device was cleared. What were its predicates? Only available on PDFs, and it turns out that it's really hard to do. So we're working on that. The alternative is to, hire a large cadre of research assistants to manually do this. So that's sort of the next step is the feasibility study. I'll also use that to try to refine the questions that I'm asking. And then ultimately what I hope to do is to actually assemble the data on that whole cadre of devices that have been approved in the last 20 years. Going back beyond that, the data just, even though it's available on the website, it's not in a format that contains everything that you need. And so there is sort of a hard horizon, sort of beyond which, if I wanted to get it, it was going to have to be a FOIA request for every device that was cleared, and that was not going to be feasible. But again, the idea is to try to identify ways that we might be able to reform the current 510K program in a way that would get at the problems without stifling innovation. And so I think that I'll stop there and answer questions. Yes.
Yeah, I was interested in the ICD which you because that was the first coverage with evidence development program under Medicare with the new clinical trials program. Actually, the predicate for that was one volume reduction study 2 years earlier. But in that national coverage decision for Medicare, there was a requirement to be certified for data collection, and there was a collaboration with American College of Cardiology, the registry,
Right.
and the idea that would be that you could get better data beyond the NATA-2 trial.
Yeah.
And then you would be able to make better coverage decisions. And since that time, there have been other, examples of collaboration and a parallel review process with Medicare. So my question is whether the collaboration with Medicare and Medicare requiring additional evidence, if that would be some way to generate some of this clinical evidence that is lacking, that sort of a backdoor reform
Right. Right.
through Medicare.
Yeah, I think so. And so a couple of things. One is that in some of my other work, I really take a much broader view of regulation because there are other regulators in the game. We tend to think of regulators as an agency and what an agency does, but pretty clearly payers are regulators, right? If they decide they're going to cover a product, right, that not only is going to help that product, it's going to tell innovators where they should be directing their resources. Physicians and hospitals are regulators to the extent that they're prescribing and use decisions are going to provide analogous signals. Tort law, products liability law, right, imposing liability on manufacturers for defective devices when the law can function like that is a form of regulation. So I think that it is worth taking a broader view, and I do think that sort of that kind of collaboration seemed really exciting. One of the problems that I see is that when we think about that iterative process of innovation, so there's a device right now, and so we can start looking at that device post-market, right? The device is now approved or cleared, and we can start to do a registry and gather information about it. If we find that there's a problem with that device, we're probably going to find it 3 years, 5 years from now. The life cycle of device is about 2.5 years. Going to be 2 generations of technology downstream from that device, right? So I'm not saying that it's not worth doing. I still think it's incredibly valuable work, and it would probably, at least to some extent, redirect innovation, but it's not going to completely close the problems that we have.
I'm going to have people use the microphone so we can pick up your voices out.
All right. I'm going to take prerogative because I have to leave in a couple minutes to teach a class related to technology adoption. So I'm really curious about how this works for a product like Intuitive Surgical's Da Vinci surgical robot, which I'm guessing somehow, I mean, I don't know if it was a PMA or a 510, like which way it slipped in, but you mentioned that there is often a requirement for more clinical trials if you're going to be applying the device to a different disease or body system or something. But of course, it seems like that particular device has been adopted all over the flippin' place with relatively little data saying that it actually is beneficial and a reasonable amount of data saying it can be harmful. So I'm curious from a regulatory standpoint, what's going on? And then there's a part of me that says doctors need to be better consumers of this stuff. Like what are they doing wrong?
So I don't know the full sort of slate of indications that the Da Vinci system has been put to, but I suspect that a lot of what you're describing is off-label use, right? And so yes, if a manufacturer is going to seek FDA approval to expand its indications, they're going to have to perform clinical studies. The quality of those studies has been criticized, and rightfully so, right? But at least we're going to get some assessment. But off-label use, there's no requirement for clinical studies, right? The regulatory function there is really payers and malpractice litigation, right? And so you see expansions in the use of devices for indications that just aren't FDA approved. We want that, right? We want clinicians to be able to, evolve medical practice. We actually don't have a lot of data about how risky off-label use of devices is. And we know that in some areas like pediatric cardiology, all uses are off-label because the catheters just aren't tested on little kids. At least historically, they hadn't been, right? We know a little bit about drugs. Well, we know quite a bit about drugs, actually. Right? We know that there are some areas where 90% or more of prescriptions are off-label. Again, kids, pregnant women would be 2 groups. We know that a lot of those off-label prescriptions are not supported by clinical trial evidence. And now we do have what appears to be an emerging body of research evidence that shows that off-label uses not supported by clinical trial evidence do pose higher risk for drugs. Right? We haven't translated that to the device context yet. I think so. Say that's a gap in our knowledge.
Out of you mentioned the device manufacturers citing statistics about approval being quicker in Europe. So just this point, I'm curious, is that true? And B, what's different about the way the Europeans regulate that
Um,
expedites?
so an embarrassingly large gap in my understanding of this world is understanding how approval takes place in Europe. But I do think that I do think there's evidence that approvals do happen more quickly there. What that means in terms of safety and effectiveness is unclear to me, and the specifics of why, in the Maykower study, the survey that I cited from 2010 of device company executives, a lot of what they were talking about was one, risk averse, that FDA personnel had become far more risk averse than their European counterparts, and two, that FDA personnel tend to rotate much more frequently. And so as you go through the regulatory process as a manufacturer, you walk into a meeting one day and there's a whole new set of faces and people who don't have that background understanding of, what the device is, where the process has been, and it kind of continuously, sets the clock back. But again, I think that I don't know if in Europe to get the CE mark, whether there's more clinical trials required, less clinical trials. That part I'm not clear on.
So you mentioned one of the hypotheses that you're going to be looking at is sort of quicker review, and I know that under devices there's a breakthrough therapy designation. So how do you think about that program in terms of the evidence that you already have that things may be moving a little quick?
So the factor that I was planning on looking at was we know it's really easy to get the data off of the FDA website. We know the day that the 510(k) submission was made. We know the day that the clearance was granted, and so it's easy to figure out how long. And what I wanted to look at was just, do the devices in like the shorter, the shortest quartile of review have a higher risk of recall, or figuring out exactly how to pre-specify that endpoint. In terms of breakthrough, there are some differences, and so that sort of linear process that we tend to think of, like with drugs, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, right? That's largely not happening now. And one of the things breakthrough does is it lets manufacturers have that rolling approval process where they can submit their data piecemeal, right? And so once you complete one piece of the data requirement, that can go into the FDA and they can okay it, right? They can say, okay, we're going to sign off on that so that when it's time to do the full review, they're not starting from scratch. So that may make it sort of an apples and oranges comparison. Part of the other problem is that right now, I think it's a surprisingly small number of devices that have actually reached the market as breakthrough devices. FDA has designated a lot of devices as breakthrough devices, but the last I checked, we were still under 100 devices that were breakthrough that actually got approved under any of the pathways. Yeah, that was the number I had in mind.
Any more questions in the room? We do have one question online, even though we weren't going to do online, but I'll go ahead and read this one. How do we account for the fact that there are many limitations in our post-market device safety surveillance infrastructure, such as that we may not be identifying many device-related adverse events?
It's a real problem. I mean, that's the plain and simple answer, right? We still have underreporting, right? So first of all, we have limits in who has to report, right? So manufacturers have to report to FDA deaths, serious injury that happens as a result of the device use. Institutions have to report, I think they have to report death to the FDA, injuries at least to the manufacturer. Physicians don't have any obligation to report. Patients don't have any obligation to report and probably don't even know how to report in those instances. And so there's a lot of underreporting that goes on. When you look at the databases like MAUDE, the medical device user reporting system, there are also a lot of duplicate reports. And so it becomes very difficult to get a solid understanding at the level of reports how many devices are problematic, which is why a lot of people who do the kind of work that I do rely on class 1 recalls as their marker. It really is, one way that's been filtered already through the FDA. doesn't involve investigator subjectivity, and avoids having to plow through 1 million or more reports to the database every year. But it is a problem, and using class 1 recalls is a somewhat problematic metric. It's the best we've come up with at this point. So I don't have a good answer.
So we have one final question online, and are there any, or do we have one in the room here?
Yeah.
And that is, what's your prediction in the next 5 to 10 years? Is there any political will to do a major reform, require more clinical evidence
So-
in the next 5 to 10 years?
So I would hope that, turning 50 might be a good impetus to take a serious look, take a step back, reassess your life choices, but I don't, there have been calls for reform, including, in 2011, the then Institute of Medicine advised just getting rid of the 510(k) program and coming up with something completely new. The program is as robust as ever. It is the manufacturer's go-to route to the market for a lot of devices. So the other thing that might make a change is a catastrophe. And what we know is that FDA authority has been expanded in response to catastrophes, right? So authority over biologics in 1902 after tainted vaccines and anti-sera, authority over drugs in 1938 after elixir sulfanilamide, an antibiotic dissolved in methyl alcohol, I think, killed 100 kids. Authority over medical devices in the early 70s because of things like the Delcon shield. And so I think that, I mean, quite honestly, part of what I hope to accomplish is just to have some suggestions in place so that the next disaster doesn't go kind of unused.
The question that we had before was just your comments on the IOM's report that 510
Yep.
should be. And then we have one other question I think we have time for, unless there are any other questions in the room. Okay, so it says FDA's Delta initiative now does real-time assessment of safety utilizing registry data, allowing identification of safety problems potentially 2 years sooner than older models of safety assessment. I'm not sure what the question is here.
So I need to look at that, and I don't know the specifics. All right, the FDA has had a number of programs that focus on certain sets of devices, and I think that those are useful. I mean, one of them was the Sentinel program, I think, right? They're useful to get safety signals earlier, and so, so I think those are going to be, anything like that is going to be helpful. I just can't respond because I don't know the specifics of the Delta program.
Well, I want to thank you for doing our October Grand Rounds
Thank you.
for IGS today. And just to let everybody know, our next Grand Rounds are actually going to be on a Thursday to accommodate our speaker schedule. So they'll be on November 7th with Ingrid Nemhard. And look for the information for that. Hope to see you in person.